You're listening to Innovation for Alpha, where we explore everything at the intersection of healthcare innovation and finance. Through our discussions and interviews, we keep you informed and educated about healthcare innovations, next-level venture investing, and everything involving the combination of the two.
Hi, everybody. This is Tobin Arthur for another episode of Innovation for Alpha. Welcome. And I'm excited today. We're taking a little bit of a twist, a step away from innovative startups, and instead talking to somebody who's got a really interesting consulting firm based on his experience. Tommy Barletta, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tobin, thanks for having me.
It's going to be fun, Tommy, to learn a little bit more about your background and how this relates to startups and companies really across the continuum in healthcare. Why don't you just give a little sense of your professional background, and then we'll get to what you're working on here and now.
Sure, Tobin, and thanks again. I'm someone who throughout my career has operated at the intersection of Washington healthcare policy and financial markets. Worked on the Hill for a number of years, worked for an investment advisory firm, and then recently launched a consulting firm called Jones Point. Jones Point, for a bit of history, is a 19th century lighthouse in Alexandria that sailors used to navigate the Potomac River. And I think, we draw inspiration from that in the company's kind of ethos, because ultimately, if you're operating in healthcare and you're trying to, navigate whether it's HHS, CMS, or FDA, it can be challenging, and especially for smaller early stage companies. There's an opportunity there that I identified to help them get a good outcome. Ultimately, if you're trying to disrupt healthcare, which a lot of people are, rightly so, because it's in need of disruption, understanding how to navigate K Street, navigate the halls of Congress is crucial to the success there.
I don't know that I asked you this, but actually, how did you get into this career? What was the interest? What were the things as you were going through school and kind of up and coming that drew you to being, a consultant and doing this kind of work? Sure.
As I said, I started out of college after I graduated from Wake Forest University, working as a Hill staffer. Very sometimes unglorious work, but worked on a number of healthcare policy related items for now former Congressman Cal Dooley, including the prescription drug benefit that was passed in the early 2000s, and really got to see firsthand the kind of intersection between policy, the business of healthcare and markets, and was absolutely captivated by it. Decided to take a bit of a turn. Instead of going to be a lobbyist or going to law school, decided to get my MBA at Georgetown, and then moved to New York to work for the Marwood Group, which is, I would say, best in class investment advisory and private equity due diligence firm. So always been very close to healthcare, but the kind of the business side of it. I'm blessed with a sister who's an MD, PhD, and an OBGYN. So she covers the science and I cover the policy piece. So thanks for fun Thanksgiving conversation.
Well, as you mentioned, the federal halls, Washington, D.C., it's a Byzantine space for people who have not spent time on the Hill and worked there. It's daunting. And as you mentioned, most everybody, if you're building a startup, you're trying to disrupt something in one shape or form. So give us a sense of the kinds of clients that you work with, across the continuum, because I know it's variable, but what kinds of problems are they solving? Just, a few specifics so people know where to kind of place the types of things you're talking about.
Sure. To break it down, first, from a sector perspective, I have the benefit of being sector agnostic across healthcare. So work with companies in life sciences, healthcare services, med tech. And a lot of times in the government and in the health space, you're either playing offense or you're playing defense, right? And most of the folks I work with are trying to play offense, expand market opportunities, look for sources of federal funding, create pathways within the FDA, occasionally avoid negative outcomes from CMS changes in reimbursement. But I think I'd like to describe things in the context of offense and defense. So from an FDA perspective, that can mean working to get some clarity on a particular regulatory pathway for a therapy. In the medical device space, you think about like digital therapeutics, right? There's been an explosion of we'll call it behavioral health focused digital apps, making sure there's increased coverage from CMS perspective, or making sure that insurers are actually living up to what they're supposed to do under law by covering such things. So that's interesting. On the services side, a lot of it is, again, how do we get more coverage for whether it's, nursing home help, again, on the behavioral side, that's a big focus in Congress, and probably will be for the next 18 months. But again, it kind of comes down to to market access and making sure that you have the broadest market possible, and also reimbursed at a level that makes the business work.
That makes sense. And so there's probably a handful of agencies that everybody's familiar with that this, generally involves. And as you mentioned, it's sort of reimbursement issues, it's regulatory pathways, and it's also anticipating. We were just chatting a few minutes ago about where the puck's going, to use another sports metaphor. So if I'm a company and I don't understand where the market's headed, I could obviously get myself into trouble because I haven't anticipated something that could be, damaging to the business, or the flip side, where there's something coming that could be a big opportunity for us, and we want to take advantage. How much are you sort of monitoring these different, things moving their way through Congress and anticipating how these might affect and influence clients?
Absolutely, Tobin. That's a great point. And that's where I spend the majority of my time, what I spend the majority of my time on, and why the experience at Marwood was so valuable for launching this business. When you're an investment research analyst, you're always looking around the corner. What's the next catalyst? What's on the horizon? Because buy-side analysts, they know what has happened. They want to know what will happen. And so do spend a lot of time thinking about and looking through public documents and news flow about kind of where things might change down the road, whether it's something as, a secondary knock-on effect of what is the impact of a potential change in Roe versus Wade on telemedicine companies. That is an issue that's front and center in Washington now. It's something probably most folks didn't think about when they got into the space, but those are the areas like that. So a lot of times, and it can be everything from where Congress might be going. Again, looking ahead to November, it's very likely we're going to be facing a split Congress, or maybe just Republican Congress and Democratic White House, and where we're thinking about the areas where there could be common ground, where there could be things accomplished, right? So I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and also on the agency side, right? We have a new FDA commissioner, Dr. Califf. So what are his priorities going to be, and what does that mean for the life sciences space? And then lastly, on the legislative side, things come front and center for a number of reasons, and one of them is timing, right? There are laws that expire and need to be reauthorized. A lot of the FDA authorization legislation expired this year. They're going through a process now in Congress. That'll finish. But next year, there's a Pandemic Preparedness Act that expires, needs to be reauthorized. And that's an area that I think could be a lot of interest for folks in healthcare, in life sciences, and maybe also in any kind of med tech, as we think about how do we point the government in the right-ish direction to deal with the next potential pandemic, whether it's something as material as COVID, or something more, kind of in the national defense, type context.
So we're big fans of having startups take things off their plates that are not their core expertise, so they can focus in on the things that they specifically are good at. And this seems to me a very obvious place for that, where it doesn't make sense for the entrepreneur, he or she, to be staying on top of all of the changes that may or may not be coming and trying to push things through. And this is where you would come in, pardon me. But there's just also a reality too, in the earlier stages, they're building technology, they're trying to get something ready, they're raising capital. So there's a pragmatic point at which it makes sense for them to start to engage and to think a little bit more commercially and so forth. It's probably never too early to be thinking about certain things, but there is a pragmatic piece of, you've also got to have some capital, because this process isn't free. Talk a little bit about, as an entrepreneur, where should they be thinking about having a conversation with you, getting to know maybe even the questions to be asking, and knowing when to jump in and have somebody, whether it's on retainer or a specific project that maybe they're focused on? I mean, what's that engagement typically look like for you?
Yeah, sure. So I have a couple of answers to that question. I think most directly, I think the folks that, the kind of sweet spot here are folks kind of beyond their early round. They've kind of figured out product market fit, and they're kind of really getting close to that commercialization, on the healthcare side. Maybe you're really starting to engage with payers about getting your product or your service reimbursed, and have cash on hand to compensate the folks that I work with in my network. And again, my role here is if you have a specific problem, I have a bespoke, kind of curated network of folks in DC who are kind of best in class at it. So again, if you need something in the pandemic space, there's a firm who's very good at that I work with. And so you do need to have some cash on hand to devote to it, and for the regulatory strategy to be a core part of what you see as your business plan. And then from my perspective, I think there's a lot of value that I can add just in a translation capacity. And I think your point about founders not having time is important. Working in healthcare, working in capital markets for a number of years, and understanding kind of, I always joke I'm bilingual. I can speak kind of both languages. That can be incredibly helpful for a founder who may not have the time for a full-time government affairs person, but certainly something where I can step in and say, this is what it says, this is what it means, this is what it means for you. Think about what you want to do. And I think that translation can be incredibly valuable and just remove, a source of stress, but also, devote more time on what the most pressing issues are. So
you mentioned something there. It made me think about large companies have tons of resources. They've got regulatory affairs people on staff, and they've got, or at least a retainer, and they've got people that are feeding them this information. But the value for startups is to be scrappy and nimble and fast, and they got to be able to compete with that. And so it seems to me this is partly where you come in, and sort of what comes to mind, you were mentioning, it's almost like you're quarterbacking, because these, Washington's not just one monolithic thing. There's all these different Byzantine places. And so it sounds like you've built a network of folks that, maybe, these people are experts in FDA. These particular people are HHS. It's not like, the same person who's cutting across. And so you can actually pull in, which from the startup's perspective means they've got a resource that's helping them navigate this alongside the big folks who have, a lot more. Is that a fair sort of characterization at a high level?
It is, and I'm a big golfer, so the caddy analogy I think is actually really good, right? You're looking at a certain yardage and wind and what the right shot is and what the right approach is, and I think that's a great analogy for, you're a company, you're trying to get product market fit, grow as fast as possible. What are the things you need to be aware of, and to really push the analogy for the other crosswinds that you should be cognizant of from that perspective, and you have kind of tools in the toolkit and how best to deploy those, whether it's where you're located, right? If you're a business coming out of an academic medical center in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, well, that's incredibly advantageous given, the Senate minority and potentially majority leader, right? How do you pull those levers? So I think that's a great analogy, golfer, quarterback, caddy, what have you. So.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that occurs to me is that as the company is evolving and they need more and more of your time, what does that look like in terms of engagements? Is this and I guess it probably depends, of course, on project by project, but is this the entrepreneurs? Are they typically talking with you on a weekly basis? Is it, let's touch base once a month, and as things maybe get to a specific project, it heats up? And what's that engagement look like for somebody who's never dealt with regulatory affairs in Washington and maybe anticipating what that's going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to give you the it kind of depends answer, but it kind of depends on what you're doing, right? I think a lot of times the process in Washington from a regulatory perspective, right? So that's agencies like CMS, FDA, it can be very prescriptive, right? You have a comment period, you've got to submit things. Whereas legislatively, it can be very much fits and starts. I think a lot of folks, there's usually, from a legislative perspective, they'll start there. There's usually a catalyst, right? Something has become important to policymakers in Washington. They'd like to enact policy in that fashion, in that area. And you're saying, okay, we want to be part of that change. How do we engage and kind of develop a plan and then find the right opportunities along that path to engage? From a regulatory perspective, sometimes there is a natural process that's evolving. You say, okay, I just want to tether ourselves to that, and you kind of follow the process that exists. And I think the third one is if you're trying to raise the attention or raise your profile among regulators like CMS or HHS or FDA, it's a bit of both. So it's there's not real one solid answer, but I guess I would lean on the fact that usually it follows the rhythms of Congress. If you're trying to pass a law, and the agencies can tend to be a bit more prescriptive on their processes.
Seems to me also you are in some ways an insurance policy, where if I'm a company that's now funded, I've got venture backing, as an investor, I want to know that these entrepreneurs have the resources to not get blindsided by things. And so knowing that they've got a relationship with you and can get answers to these questions seems like a bit of a no-brainer as an insurance policy. But as you think about you're talking about the headwinds, how do you particularly stay on top of what's Congress thinking about? Is this just boots on the ground? You're just constantly talking to folks, constantly reading? I mean, how do you get a sense of the pulse and where you might advise clients? And you've got a particularly interesting background because you also have some of the investment perspective.
Right.
And so you're not just thinking about how do we get them through X, Y, Z, but is this, makes sense investment wise? How much does that also weigh into the conversations with your clients?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for the comment about the insurance policy, because I do think that's an element to it. It's, and back to my analogy of offense versus defense, but you're right. I think there's a lot of times where, kind of, again, back to the lighthouse analogy, right? It's kind of looking out there and seeing what's on the horizon that might be concerning. As far as staying in the loop on things, a voracious reader of all things inside the Beltway DC healthcare policy, a ton of sources, and having done this for over a decade, you kind of know what the good ones are. Still keep a very extensive and tight network in both finance and in the kind of, I'll say New York finance, which is a broad generalization. Apologies to folks in San Francisco and Boston. But also, my network in Washington, right? I mean, I've worked on the Hill in early 2000s and have been, a creature of Washington, a member of the swamp, I suppose, some would say, for the better part of 20 years. And so just, staying in touch with folks, texts, coffees, emails, I think as the world fortunately has started to open up. It's a good time to start a business like this because people are excited to go back together and meet up and grab coffee and things like that. So it's really a combination, but that's been honed over 20 years of kind of sitting in the same place of thinking about things from those different policy, markets, and DC perspectives.
Does it weigh into your conversations with clients where, maybe they think they're just asking you about some kind of a regulatory question, but do you actually have conversations about the legitimacy of a particular path from an investment perspective? Because ultimately the entrepreneur is the biggest investor. They're investing their time, oftentimes their own money as well. I mean, do you ever find yourself having a conversation saying, I'm not really sure this is the best investment, this particular path, or, here's how I might think about mitigating that risk? I mean, how much of that is that crossover, outside of your boundaries, so to speak? But because you do have this unique background, you've got both the regulatory and the financial backgrounds.
I'd say it informs the work that I do and the conversations, but the guiding kind of focus for me is on the policy side. I think that's my background, that's the strong suit, but certainly it plays a role when you're thinking about, a space like, someone again, I go back to the digital health space, right? There's a lot of companies in this space, and kind of having your pulse on the market and saying, like, here's where people are, I think can be incredibly helpful. Or here's what the market looks like. These folks are attacking this niche versus that. I think can be helpful in forming that regulatory strategy. So I think I'll say a little bit of both, but certainly informs it. But the guiding focus here is the Washington policy side.
One sort of final question, I'm curious of your opinion. So we're sitting here in late May 2022, and there's all kinds of speculation. Inflation's a big problem. We've got turmoil in Ukraine and obviously related gas prices, at least in part. We've got midterm elections. You've alluded to that. Everybody's expecting a pretty significant shift there. From the part of the world that we live in is a lot of concern about how is this going to impact capital for the venture and the angel community. Is it going to slow down because people are concerned and they're going to sit on the sidelines? I mean, what's your general perspective around, because all these things are intertwined. I mean, politics and finance are, deeply interconnected. If you had a crystal ball, how do you look at the next 6 months from the lens of both investors investing in healthcare and med tech, and then for entrepreneurs, good time to start things, bad time to start things? What should they be thinking about?
Sure. I think without question, the pullback in the public markets has been well kind of documented, has resulted in a bit of a pullback in the private markets as well. And I've kind of seen that in calls I've been on. I do think that one thing that's great about healthcare is that, I always joke, is it a feature of a bug that's around 15 to 20% of the US GDP? And I think from a healthcare perspective, you can be comforted by a couple things. I think one, the pandemic really showed opportunity is probably the wrong choice of words, but we'll go with it, where there are cracks in the healthcare system, whether it's from the labor market side, right? I think we may be fundamentally rethinking how we staff hospitals going forward and healthcare facilities, right? You have a labor shortage. People don't want to work in some sectors anymore because of the hours and because of the risk. So that does create opportunity for disruptive businesses. There was a New York Times article probably 6 months ago about the impact of pediatric and kind of adolescent behavioral health from being home from school. I mean, I have 3 children. They were home from school for a couple of years. What the impact has. Again, probably not a very precise word, but we'll say opportunity there. But the other thing is the government will continue because they are a large purchaser of healthcare across the board, there continues to be a lot of dollars flowing. And again, we talked about this before, of also non-dilutive capital out there. There is interest in, whether it's Department of Defense, whether it's HHS, of funding different things that can make the system work better. And I think that serves as a nice ballast to entrepreneurs in the space. Right, we are still looking for curative therapies for things that affect folks, and it's getting to the point with some of the gene editing technology that we're getting down to a very small sample size that you need to move forward with something. So I think it's incredibly kind of an optimistic time and opportunistic time. But certainly I think as folks are looking for funding rounds, it's probably a little more challenging than it was 6 months ago to ask for that big check, or especially on the seed side. I think a lot of the kind of high net worth individuals who used to write checks like that may be a bit more thoughtful than they were 6 months ago. So
yeah, well said. And the way one of the things that we advocate for, it's not our particular philosophy. We just steal from Warren Buffett, one of the best investors of all time. He says you should be buying when others are selling and selling when others are buying. And I think that speaks to what you said a little bit earlier about your own consultancy, which is this is a great time to start things when things are there's a little bit of headwind and challenge. That also creates opportunity, because the folks that don't necessarily know what they're doing or don't have the stronghold are going to fall by the wayside, and those that have this staying power are going to create separation. So we like the opportunity over the next couple of years. As you mentioned, it may be a little more tricky on the capital side, but if you can weather through that part of it, good things are ahead. Tommy, as companies are hearing this and think, I should probably be aware of your services, what's the best way for folks to engage with you and reach you? And we can put the information in the show notes, but how do you typically start a conversation or relationship with a client?
Yeah, sure. And would love for you to put the website in the show notes, or through LinkedIn as the best ways to get in touch with me. And I think one of the best things about getting into the entrepreneurial world is the openness of all parties to just have conversations. I think that's a great place to start. And it's great to be in a world where everyone's happy to get on the phone and happy to be helpful. And I always say, I'm happy to do calls. I'm not a law firm. I don't charge by the hour. So I'm happy just to chat and say, hey, I can connect you with someone, maybe it's helpful. But I think, it just starts with a conversation to say, this makes sense and this doesn't, and say, hey, maybe let's check back in 6 months when you've got that next round of funding and you feel like you really can devote the capital to doing something here. Because also the folks that I work with in DC are always happy to do the same thing, because, we're bringing a different client base to them, and they always appreciate that. So yeah, always happy to chat. And what's great about this space is there's so much innovation. It's so exciting. It's hard not to get overly excited by everything that comes down the pike. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, appreciate you spending time. It's great to start to get to know you. And, I also would love to have more and more of your thought leadership across the network. I think a lot of times the challenge for entrepreneurs, they don't know what they don't know. And so the more they can start to get a baseline of how do I think about this particular space, the easier it is for them to know, what they should be asking and help with, and maybe when, so that it's a good filter for you. But we'll jump across that bridge as we move forward. And Tommy, I really appreciate you spending some time today, and look forward to, creating more exposure with the community so that they can get the resources they need to navigate the Byzantine halls of the District of Columbia.
Tobin, thank you again for the opportunity. It was an enjoyable conversation. Look forward to continuing the relationship. So thanks.
See you again soon for the next episode of Innovation for Alpha. Make sure to go to Innovation for Alpha for access to prior episode links, show notes, and other valuable resources. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Before making any investment decisions, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by Angel MD Media, and written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.